I've got a problem. I'm turning around, coming back. Power, losing power, 886 Mike Juliet.
Alright, welcome back. Thanks for joining me for part 2 of my 3-part series on what happened to me and my airplane, 886 Mike Juliet. So in part 1, I explained about the airplane, about my experience, pilot experience, and part 2 is going to be the accident sequence, what I did when I did it, what went wrong. In hindsight, some things I might have been able to do different, but and then we'll come back for part 3. I'll show you all the damage, how things came apart, and how I'm going to put the airplane back together. So we'll be using Adobe Captivate today to do most of this on the screen while I narrate, and hopefully that'll go smooth. I haven't used Captivate for a long time, but seems to be working, so let's get on with it. Alright, so you're looking at the airplane at the end of the accident sequence, and what led up to this, I'll play just a short snippet of the audio.
Mike Juliet, yeah, I've got a problem. I'm turning around, coming back. Power, losing power, 886 Mike Juliet.
Alright, so that's kind of how it all started. And so we'll start off here with a, I believe this is it. Yeah, so this is the flight actually from the day before and that day. And unfortunately, this website, aprs.fi, tends to mix things up a little bit on dates. I think they might be using Zulu time. Anyway, we're going to ignore the stuff on the left side of the screen there. That was the day before. And we'll just concentrate on this portion right here. So, this all started in the afternoon on May 26th. And I took off and headed over to Poplar Grove Airport, just on the east side of Rockford, and ended up over there in about, I think it was about 8 minutes, 9 minutes, something like that. Tell you what, we'll bring up my report to the NTSB here and take a look at exactly the timeline I reported. So, departed at 15:50. Let's see, I landed at Poplar Grove at 16:09 and shut down the engine. And so I was on the ground for 40 minutes. During that time, the engine was kind of heat soaking everything inside the engine compartment under the cowl. And so just to give you a little bit of background, and I was unaware that the Ellison throttle body injection units had this issue. This airplane has an EFS 3A that's mounted under the engine near the oil pan. Actually, the fuel line runs right, it actually touches the oil pan. It has fire sleeve on it, but it touches the oil pan. That's how close this is mounted. So everything in the engine compartment was heat soaking for 40 minutes. As you can see here, 16:49, I started the engine to depart, and everything was normal. Didn't notice any issues whatsoever. 16:53, I took off, and I'm getting these times from my APRS, which is a ham radio transmitter that transmits a data packet to a local repeater, and it goes into the APRS server. And in that packet is all my GPS data. So lat long, altitude, speed. There's a bunch of stuff. You can actually add text to it when you program the radio and stuff. So the APRS was programmed to record every 30 seconds or to transmit a packet of data every 30 seconds. 99% of the time those packets get through. Sometimes they don't. If the repeater station is busy, your packet may not get through. So it's not guaranteed delivery. So anyway, back to this. 1653, I took off. I'll go ahead and slide this out of the way, and we'll go back to the map. Now, I'll zoom out a little bit. The data points show up as these little dots. And as you mouse over them, it will show you what repeater it was talking to at the time. And if you click on the dot, you actually get the data. So this is right after takeoff at 99 miles an hour and 1,227 feet. That's MSL. So really, I think field elevation there is 859 or something like that. So it wasn't very high in the air. It didn't capture, it typically doesn't capture on the ground, so it's not surprising. It draws a line between the last data point down here in the corner and the next data point. It doesn't know that there's 40 minutes in between those 2 points. So taking off, I am, I don't know, half mile from the runway at this point. The next data point is right here. I'm at 107, so I've gained a little bit of altitude. I've gained a little bit of speed, 1,381 feet. And let's see. This is mainly housing. I'll switch the maps to satellite so you can see trees and housing. I was pretty much, I was runway heading at that point. And it was at this point that I kind of sensed that something wasn't quite right. I wasn't climbing very fast, maybe 200 or 300 feet a minute. It's also at this point that I looked at the I noticed the airplane wasn't climbing, and I guess at this point I got my first hint of some smoke in the cockpit. Actually, that was not unusual for this engine. I had a seal, prop hub seal leaking, and I typically would get just a little puff of smoke in the cockpit right after takeoff, and then that would go away and I'd never see it again. So I attributed that to the prop hub seal. And I'll talk about this in a few minutes, but my problem was not the prop hub seal. The first time I did see it, probably a month or two ago, I did pull all the cowling off and look. I could not find where the smoke would have been coming from. But probably my next 10 flights, it was always the same. Just get a little hint of haziness in the cockpit, and then it would go away. So anyway, I noticed that around this time, and I scanned the oil pressure and oil temp, and noticed that oil pressure was down just a little bit. I had always seen 40 psi, sometimes 45 psi, and I had 35. And I also glanced right above that gauge is the oil temp. Never seen any oil temps over 220. Maybe 222, 224 tops. What I saw was at least 230, and it was climbing, obviously. So the engine was hotter than I'd ever seen it. Oil temperature or oil pressure was a little bit low, So what I did was I lowered the nose to pick up some speed. I figured I'd just force some more air through the cowling, cool things off. So I did speed up the next data point. I went from 107, I think, to 109, and then the next data point's 112. So I sped up a little bit. It had absolutely no effect. So at this point, where I'm showing you on the screen right now, and I'll zoom in here, the smoke in the cockpit started to increase. More smoke than I had ever seen before. And for a second, you kind of in disbelief saying, no, this can't be happening. But I knew, and I knew it was oil smoke, but then again, I didn't, you can't see under the cowling, you don't know what's going on. I could have been on fire. I made a decision within about 10 or 15 seconds that I was going to turn and go back to the airport, that this was just getting worse, and I needed to be on the ground. So at this point, probably just past here, up in this area up in here, I made a radio call that you heard earlier, just a blind call. I was still on 122.8, which was Poplar Grove, and said, turning around, coming back to the airport, I've got a problem. So the next 3 points are, and since these are 30 seconds apart, it's not very detailed, but this is the initial 180 degree turn. Now I was at 1,516 feet here, which equates to 658 AGL. So it wasn't all that high in the air. When I completed the turn, headed back to the airport, which would be down here, I was at 1421, so I'd lost about 100 feet. And so now I'm at 563. And what I'm looking at is between me and the airport, which is right down in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. This is houses and trees, and I couldn't see these fields at that altitude, so I knew I was going to have very, very limited choices. Also at this point right here, the engine was starting to run rougher. Didn't know why, smoke in the cockpit, rough running engine. I made the choice that I was not going to attempt this, to traverse this area right here of trees and houses. So you can see the data point right here, which is actually a little bit off. I was actually, don't know why it's putting it there. It should actually be probably back a couple 100 feet. I made the last call that I was not going to make it back to the airport, and I was landing in a field. So I started my turn actually back here somewhere and did a very tight 180. Finally got lined up right about over this house. I'll zoom in again. Okay, so my turn to final, if you will, was right over this barn, and I probably hit the ground in this area right here. Now you can't see it, but this is a low area. It comes up to a rise that runs this direction. It goes, kind of flattens out and rises again over here. I was on this high point right here. So my first hit hard and fast. I was able to get the speed brake down to 50%. I was kind of dumping that speed brake as I rolled out over this barn here. And I had to get back to flying the airplane. I couldn't worry about holding that switch any longer. So I hit hard, bounced into the air, Oh, and by the way, when I came over this barn, I was probably at maybe 300, 250 feet AGL. And, I was coming down pretty fast. So hit here, bounced back into the air, probably went another 200 feet, touched down again right in this area, and probably rolled about 100 feet. It's funny, kind of at that point I'm thinking, hey, this might turn out okay. And well, obviously it didn't because the last 25 feet or so was that nose wheel digging in, and then the slow motion rollover that happened. And it was slow motion. I mean, I wasn't going 20 miles an hour when that nose dug in, but it was enough to flip the airplane. So the engine was still running when I hit. So I broke one blade on my new warp drive prop. And of course the spinner was destroyed. When it flipped over, the canopy basically exploded all around me. There was nothing left of the canopy, which was good because the turtle deck and the rudder, no, not so much the rudder, but the turtle deck held up well enough that I had about a 12-inch opening just to my left where the clamshell door was. Yeah, of course it was made of plexiglass, so it exploded and wasn't there anymore. About all I could do at that point was I was kind of bent over. The plane was compressed. You can see I got the speed brakes down about halfway. So anyway, I crawled out through that little space about 12 inches high and dug my way out through the dirt. And the really only injuries I got was when the canopy came apart. It tried to take my right ear off, which needed to be sewed back. And I think while I was trying to crawl out of the cockpit, chewed up my legs pretty bad. Didn't need any stitches, but it was enough to leave me bloodied and a little bit dazed. Luckily, someone was driving by at the time, saw the whole thing happen, and we kind of met in the field and made some phone calls, waited for the ambulance. The airplane was actually moved out of the field that night by the owner at Poplar Grove Airport, and one of the FSDO employees lives near the airport and knows the owner. So between the two of them, they lifted the plane up upside down, set it on a trailer upside down, and hauled it over to the airport. So anyway, that's the sequence of events. I'll say, as far as things, how things transpired, certainly looking back on it, I made the right decision by picking that cornfield and sticking with it. It turns out the vapor lock situation that I was dealing with, which I didn't know about at the time, will eventually cause the engine to quit, and it doesn't take that long, my understanding. The engine had been running rough for probably 60 seconds at this point, so it probably would not have run another minute. The point it's showing on the map here is actually 2.7 miles from the end of the runway, and at 563 feet, I would not have made it back to the runway. I don't know where I would have ended up, but certainly did not want to end up in the trees, or hitting a house or something like that. So in hindsight, made the right decision. Picked that cornfield and just went for it. Whatever it took to get into that field, I was going to get in there. And in the end, airplanes can be replaced. And this airplane, the damage is not so bad that it can't be fixed. I've already started to repair it. It will be getting a different engine. Not that there's anything wrong with the Corvair. The Corvair really didn't fail me. The Ellison was really what caused the bulk of my problem. And if I had known that the Ellison had a limit to, I guess, how hot it could get, I probably would have made some accommodations in the cowling. It did originally have an air scoop in the cowling for the Ellison. There's been some cowling mods. That air scoop inadvertently got deleted. But there's other ways to isolate that Ellison from the heat. So, it's unfortunate that it happened. The other thing that failed, the reason I got all the smoke in the cockpit was the rear seal on the engine. I didn't find that oil when I uncowled it probably a month before. The leak must have been very, very small, just to give me a little puff of smoke or a little haziness in the cockpit on takeoff for all those hours. But it became much more serious. It just was a coincidence that it happened at the same time that the vapor lock issue started. But we found that on the rear of this Corvair is the harmonic balancer, the drive for the John Deere generator, the flywheel for the starter, and all of that was wet with oil. And it was only wet on one side, so it had been slinging the oil to the right side of the firewall, and the exhaust system on the right side of the engine was wet with oil. Nothing on the left side of the engine. So it was a failing rear seal that caused all the smoke. So, I guess seals fail sometimes. Just so happens this one failed right at that moment. And I think it was probably a good thing. I might have waited even longer to try to figure out the roughness in the engine. And just kind of a side note, the other people that have had this issue have been able to kind of work around it temporarily with the primer, and I could have done that had I known that this is what was going on. My priming system was a valve right off the fuel pumps, so I could have injected raw fuel right into the top of the intakes. Had I opened that valve a little bit, probably could have nursed it back to the airport. I don't know. But for the situation I had, the only decision I could make was to put it down in that field as quickly as possible. So that's what I did. So that's my story. And like I said, the plane's being rebuilt. I will do another video of the damage. Actually today I started removed one of the longerons, the upper right longeron in the back of the plane, probably about 24 inches of it. Cut my scarf joint. So I've already started the repair process. Being that I'm going to go with a new engine, it's probably going to take a year. I got to get the plane fixed, then I got to find an engine, probably rebuild it. So I suspect it'll be this time next year before that plane takes to the air. But and in the meantime, I'll just work on that, and all my Corvair stuff will be for sale. The engine's going to need at least the crank and the cam pulled out and checked. The cam gear is probably suspect at this point. The cam might be okay, but it should have a new crankshaft, or the crankshaft should be sent out and checked. Otherwise, the engine ran beautifully, and was really really happy with everything. So I wouldn't be afraid to fly behind a Corvair. I've just decided that I'm gonna change to a Continental or a Lycoming, most likely a Continental 0200. So anyway, thanks for listening. Look for part 3 here in a few weeks. I'll get that out as soon as I can, and I hope this was educational. And the takeaway is that training really matters. Picking that field and sticking to it was really, and flying the plane all the way until it flipped was the reason I'm walking around today. So training really does make a difference.